The lights of the studio glowed warm, soft, inviting, yet beneath that glow lingered the chill of expectation. Friday nights on the Graham Norton Show were supposed to be effortless. Actors perched in crimson chairs, trading witty anecdotes, laughter swirling like champagne bubbles. But tonight, the atmosphere carried a weight no one could quite name. Something electric, something dangerous clung to the air as Robert Downey Jr. walked onto the stage. The audience erupted in applause, a roar of adoration for the man who had risen from ashes to immortality. He waved politely, smiled with the relaxed charm that made him Iron Man to millions, and sat down. His suit gleamed, his posture was sharp, but there was a flicker in his eyes, a guarded stillness, as if he already sensed what storm was coming. Graham Norton leaned forward with his trademark grin. Robert Downey Jr., the man, the myth, the franchise. The audience chuckled, but the cadence in his voice was edged with curiosity, a sharpness that promised the night would not remain lighthearted. Robert adjusted his jacket, smiled faintly. "Thanks for having me. Feels good to be here." The words were calm, almost rehearsed, yet they hung in the air like the opening line of a testimony. The cameras panned, capturing every twitch, every blink. To the millions who would later replay this moment online, it already felt less like a talk show and more like a courtroom trial. Downey was not merely a guest, he was a defendant in the theater of public judgment, summoned to account for the sins of his past. Norton played host as though presiding judge, his desk a bench, his cards a stack of evidence. The studio audience, primed for laughter, unknowingly became jurors, ready to gasp, to clap, to weigh each exchange with silent verdicts. Downey's smile flickered again, the faint tremor of a man who knew this stage too well. Not just the stage of entertainment, but the stage of scrutiny. He had faced judges before, not in talk shows but in federal courtrooms, where laughter was replaced with cold gavel strikes and questions cut deeper than comedy ever could. Tonight carried that same air of trial, except the jury now was global, invisible, relentless. Norton's eyes sparkled with showman's bravado. He cracked a harmless joke about Tony Stark, about Marvel money, and the audience roared with laughter. But the levity was fragile. A thin mask stretched over the night's real tension. Robert chuckled politely, then let the laughter die. His body language tightened. One leg crossed, one hand gripping the armrest as though anchoring himself to the chair. It was at this moment, in the hush between jokes, that the unspoken question filled the room. How long would it take before Norton's humor turned into interrogation? How long before the court of comedy became the court of confession? A woman in the front row shifted uneasily, sensing it already. The cameras zoomed closer to Downey's face, capturing a subtle shift in his eyes, warmth dimming, caution rising. "Petit tir," Norton spoke again. It wasn't with the tone of a comedian, but of a man testing boundaries. "Robert," he began, "you've had quite the journey, haven't you? Not just Iron Man, not just the comeback, but the darker chapters too." A murmur rippled across the audience. Some smiled nervously, unsure if they should laugh. Others leaned forward, eager for drama. The line between entertainment and trial had been crossed, and everyone could feel it. Downey's jaw flexed. He gave the faintest smile, a shield. "Yeah," he said softly. "It's been a journey." The silence that followed was heavier than applause. For a moment, the entire studio felt like a courtroom where the prosecutor had just submitted his first piece of evidence. This was not going to be an interview. This was going to be a clash. And in that realization, the air cracked like a gavel. The trial had begun. Robert Downey Jr. did not walk into that studio as a blank slate. He carried with him a history heavier than any blockbuster franchise could. Mask. To the casual viewer, he was the face of Marvel, billionaire, genius, savior of cinema. But beneath the sheen of Hollywood redemption was a man who had once been shackled in orange jumpsuits, who had tasted the bitter sterility of prison cells, who had stared into the abyss of addiction and almost never returned. It is impossible to separate Robert Downey Jr., the actor, from Robert Downey Jr., the survivor. And Graham Norton knew this. That was why every quip carried the sharp aftertaste of interrogation. The audience saw charm. But Robert heard trial. In the late 90s, he had been the fallen prince of Hollywood, caught in a spiral of arrests, probation violations, and rehab stints that never held. Courtrooms became revolving doors. Judges became familiar faces. Each time he walked into a chamber, it was as though the world had already written him off. Talent wasted. Another addict lost. He was written into obituaries while still alive, and yet he had clawed his way back. Iron Man was not just a role, it was a resurrection. So when Norton leaned back in his chair, smirking, testing, Robert felt the weight of those years press against him once more. This was not playful banter. This was cross-examination. Norton's voice slipped easily between humor and precision. "You've had quite a road, Robert. I mean, people forget just how low it got, don't they?" A murmur rippled in the audience. Some laughed, not cruelly but awkwardly, unsure how to respond. Others held their breath, sensing danger in the question. Robert's eyes narrowed slightly, the faintest flicker of irritation. His smile was practiced but brittle. He spoke slowly, choosing each word as though they might be entered into court record. "I wouldn't say people forget," he said. "I'd say they choose what to remember." The room stilled. The answer was poised, elegant, but it carried a sharp undertone. It was the kind of line a witness might deliver after years of being grilled, weary, defensive, but undeniable. Norton chuckled, sensing both resistance and opportunity. "That's very philosophical," he replied, leaning closer. "But, surely, you don't mind talking about it now? I mean, it's all part of the comeback story, isn't it?" Robert tilted his head, eyes unblinking. "Depends who's asking," he said. The audience gasped. It wasn't loud, but it was collective, a sharp inhale that betrayed their unease. In that instant, the glamour of the red chairs dissolved. The set became a tribunal. Norton the host became Norton the prosecutor, armed with sly grins and leading questions. Robert, the man who had once stood before actual judges, now stood trial again in the court of comedy. And that was the bitter irony. He had already paid his price. Prison, rehab, years of humiliation splashed across tabloids. The public had feasted on his downfall, then crowned him king again when Marvel resurrected his image. And now here, on a talk show couch, Graham Norton was summoning the ghosts back into the spotlight, demanding Robert justify his survival. Robert shifted in his seat, his hand tapping the armrest rhythmically, not out of nervousness but as though he were holding himself steady. His voice, when it returned, was measured, heavy. "You know," he said, "there comes a point where you stop testifying for your past. Either people accept who you are now or they don't. But you don't live your life on trial forever." The silence was palpable. The audience looked to Norton for a punchline, for levity to break the tension, but there was none. Norton smiled thinly, but behind the smile his eyes flickered, the look of a man realizing he had stepped onto dangerous ground, and the ground was beginning to shift beneath him. Robert sat taller, his composure firm, the faint trace of defiance in his posture. He had faced real judges in real courts, men with gavels who could take his freedom away. Compared to that, Graham Norton was merely another cross-examiner with a microphone. The trial had been reignited. But Robert Downey Jr. was no longer the trembling defendant of the 90s. He was something far more formidable now, a man who had beaten the courtroom once before, and was ready to do it again. Graham Norton had built his reputation on a peculiar kind of charm. He wasn't a predator on stage, he was a magician. He lulled his guests into comfort, softened them with laughter, and only then, when the guard was down, slid in a question sharp enough to pierce. It was the needle technique, invisible, until it stung. For most celebrities it worked. They laughed, deflected, and the show carried on. But Robert Downey Jr. was not most celebrities. His scars were too deep, his survival too costly, for needles to be dismissed as banter. The first jab was small, almost playful. Norton tilted his head, voice dipped into mock curiosity. You know, Robert, you've got one of those careers where it's almost like two different lives, isn't it? The before and the after. The audience chuckled softly, sensing the setup, but Robert heard it differently. To him, it was an indictment phrased as a joke. The before was a courtroom record. The after was a struggle against ghosts that never quite released their grip. He smiled politely, lips thin. Yeah, he said. You could say that. Norton pressed further, smiling as though he were just keeping things light. I mean, prison jumpsuits to superhero suits, that's quite the transformation. Not many can say they've lived both sides of that coin. A murmur rippled through the audience. Some laughed nervously. Others gasped, waiting for Robert's reaction. The red chairs that once seemed like cozy thrones now resembled witness stands, and the studio lights felt like interrogation lamps. Downey sat back, his expression calm now, no longer defensive but resolute. Honesty isn't the same as humiliation, and I've given more of myself to the public than they'll ever truly know. But here's the part they deserve most. I survived. That's the only story worth retelling. The words fell like a closing argument, concise, irrefutable. The audience roared in approval, drowning Norton's attempted reply, and in that thunder of applause it became clear. The prosecutor had tightened his grip too far. Instead of exposing Downey, he had revealed the strength of a man who would not be cornered. The trial had backfired, and Robert Downey Jr. was winning. Every trial has a moment when civility collapses, when the arguments stop circling and finally cut to the bone. For Robert Downey Jr., that moment arrived not with a shout, but with a single insinuation. Casual on the surface, devastating underneath. Norton leaned back, his tone deceptively light, his grin steady as ever. But isn't it true, Robert, that the comeback itself, the sobriety, the discipline, the reinvention, it's all part of the performance? After all, Hollywood loves a redemption story. The audience stiffened. A ripple of unease traveled through the rows. That line had crossed an invisible boundary. This was no longer just probing. It was dismissal, an accusation that everything Robert had rebuilt, years of sweat, grit, private battles with demons, was nothing more than theater. Robert froze. For the briefest second, his face betrayed nothing. His hands rested still on the armrests, his gaze lowered, but then he looked up, and the fire in his eyes silenced the room. You think this is performance? His voice was low, almost a whisper, but the tone carried more force than any outburst could. The audience leaned in, caught in the gravity of the moment. Norton attempted to soften the blow with a laugh, waving a hand. No, I just mean, it's all part of the narrative. You've played the hero on screen and off. People eat it up. Robert cut him off, his words sharp and measured, slicing through the air. I didn't perform in rehab, Graham. I didn't act my way through withdrawal or courtrooms or prison cells. That wasn't a script. That was my life. The crowd gasped, a collective exhale that carried both shock and sympathy. The weight of the words settled heavy in the studio, impossible to dismiss. Robert leaned forward now, his body language no longer defensive but commanding. His voice rose, controlled but ringing with finality. You sit here and treat it like entertainment, like some subplot in a franchise. But for me, it was life or death. Every day. And I didn't survive all that just to have it reduced to a punchline. Norton opened his mouth, but nothing came. The smile faltered, the charm slipped, and for the first time in the night he looked cornered. The silence stretched, and then Robert gave the final blow. One line, devastating in its simplicity. He looked Norton dead in the eye. This isn't your courtroom, and I'm done testifying. The words hung in the air like a verdict. Slowly, deliberately, Robert pushed himself up from the chair. The audience gasped, then erupted into murmurs, the energy shifting from stunned silence to shocked disbelief. The red chair spun slightly behind him as he rose to his full height. He didn't shout. He didn't storm. He simply walked, steady, composed, his face unreadable, his dignity intact. Each step toward the wings was an act of defiance, each stride a refusal to play the role he'd been cast in. The cameras tracked him desperately, but even they seemed powerless to contain the gravity of his exit. The sound of his shoes against the floor echoed like a gavel strike closing the trial. The audience was frozen, some clapping instinctively, others sitting wide-eyed, hands over their mouths. The room was no longer a talk show set. It was the aftermath of a trial where the defendant had dismissed the court itself. Norton sat back, his smile gone, his cards trembling slightly in his hands. For the first time, the master of control had no control at all, and in that charged silence, Robert's absence became louder than any words he could have spoken. The trial had reached its breaking point, and Robert Downey Jr. had walked away, not defeated, but free. The studio lights burned hotter than they appeared on screen, coating the stage in a false serenity. Applause filled the air like a well-rehearsed hymn, a ritual of morning television meant to soothe, not to provoke. Kelly Ripa walked out with her trademark smile, polished to perfection, a smile that disarmed and controlled, the smile of someone who has ruled the morning for decades. She thrived in this comfort zone, in the power of chatter disguised as charm. Across from her, Angelina Jolie entered like a storm forced into stillness. She moved with deliberate calm, a woman who knew her very presence could fill the room. Her eyes scanned the studio audience, not as a performer checking approval, but as a witness scanning a jury. For Jolie, this was not theater. It was testimony waiting to be delivered. The applause dipped into silence. Kelly leaned forward with practiced warmth, her voice high and bright. "We are so thrilled to have you here today, Angelina." The audience clapped again, obedient, but their anticipation had shifted. They were not waiting for another round of jokes or easy banter. They were waiting for a collision. Angelina's lips curved into a small, restrained smile. "Thank you for having me." Her tone was low, steady, stripped of the playful rise and fall the show demanded. Kelly pressed on, her cadence rehearsed, moving with the rhythm of someone who knew how to disarm guests before she dissected them. But the air was different today. The tension wasn't playful, it was brittle. Every laugh line, every casual nod felt like a rope stretched too tight, one tug away from snapping. A question landed softly, but not without edge. Kelly asked about Angelina's new beginnings, her voice dripping with subtext, an invitation to rehash divorce headlines and gossip columns. Angelina shifted slightly in her chair, a nearly imperceptible movement, but her eyes sharpened. She was not here to be dissected. She was here with a different mission. She answered not with scandal, but with conviction. "New beginnings for me are about responsibility, about where I can be useful, especially to children who have no protection." The words sliced through the room. They were not the answers morning TV was built to carry. Kelly's smile flickered. For the briefest second, so brief most viewers might have missed it, but the live audience felt it. The atmosphere shifted, fragile but undeniable, as if someone had just placed a truth too heavy for this stage onto the coffee table between them. The interview was meant to be easy, digestible, friendly, but Angelina Jolie had already broken the unspoken contract of daytime television. She refused to play defendant in the courtroom of gossip. She would not sit in the chair of scandal. She would place the world itself on trial. And in that instant, though neither woman had yet raised her voice, everyone watching understood. This was no longer an interview. It was a collision course, and the jury was millions of viewers at home. Beneath the stage lights, there was more than conversation happening. There was theater, yes, but deeper than that. There was a struggle for control. The smiles were weapons, the pauses loaded, the glances carefully measured. Kelly Ripa, reigning queen of daytime, carried herself like a judge in her own courtroom. For years she had shaped the rhythm of mornings across America, deciding what would be laughed at, what would be whispered about, what would be dismissed as unimportant. She lived on the currency of comfort. Angelina Jolie, by contrast, had built her public life on disruption. Her frame was lean, almost fragile in silhouette, yet her presence filled the stage with a density of experience few in Hollywood could match. This was not merely an actress sitting across from a talk show host. It was the collision of two worlds, entertainment as escape versus activism as confrontation. Kelly leaned forward, legs crossed neatly, posture flawless. "Our viewers love you," she began, her tone sugar with an edge of possession. "But they also feel they don't really know you. You've been private. Do you think that distance makes people curious?" It was a masterful pivot, gentle enough to seem benign, sharp enough to pry. The implication hung in the air. "You've hidden yourself. Now reveal what you owe us." Jolie's eyes narrowed, but not with anger, with recognition. She had heard this question countless times, felt the demand behind it. She let the silence hang just long enough to make the air tremble. Then quietly she said, "Privacy isn't distance. Privacy is survival." The studio audience shifted, some nodding, others uneasy. Kelly tilted her head, smile frozen, searching for footing. "Survival?" she echoed, her voice touched with disbelief. "But you've lived in the public eye for decades. Surely there's nothing you can't handle." Jolie's gaze didn't waver. "I've seen women silenced in war zones, children erased by indifference. What I can't handle," she paused, her tone sharpening, "is being reduced to fragments of gossip while those voices go unheard." The line struck like a verdict. The audience erupted into applause, scattered at first, then swelling until it drowned out the music cues. Kelly's hand fluttered against her cue cards, but she pressed on, a flash of irritation tightening the corners of her smile. "Of course your humanitarian work is remarkable," she conceded. "But don't you think people are drawn to your story because of your humanity, your family, your life? Isn't that just as important?" It was a clever trap. Tie Jolie's activism back to personal scandal. Pull her into the realm of daytime chatter where Kelly reigned supreme. But Angelina did not step into it. Her voice was steady, stripped of performance. "My life is not more important than the lives I've seen buried in rubble. The obsession with celebrity," she said, her words now heavy with weight, "is a way of keeping people comfortable, distracted. If you can debate my dress, you never have to face a refugee child's eyes." The applause was louder this time, sharper, like a gavel striking. Kelly tried to pivot again, her laugh bright, rehearsed but brittle. "Well, our viewers like both. They want to know the woman and the world. Can't we give them both?" Jolie leaned in slightly, her expression unflinching. "They deserve more than both. They deserve honesty. If you offer them only distraction, you rob them of truth." A hush swept the room. It was no longer Kelly's stage. Jolie had turned it into a tribunal, her words indictments, her posture evidence, her conviction unassailable. The audience, once mere spectators, were now transformed into a jury, weighing not just the answers but the questions themselves. The balance of power had shifted, subtly, but undeniably. Kelly Ripa still smiled, still laughed, still gestured with the authority of a host. But every movement carried the shadow of resistance. Angelina Jolie was not there to entertain. She was there to expose, to peel back the sheen of daytime performance and reveal the raw contest underneath. In that moment, beneath the bright lights and the painted set, the clash of worlds was undeniable. Gossip versus gravity, spectacle versus survival, comfort versus conscience. And the air in the studio thickened with the awareness that this confrontation was only beginning. The cards in Kelly's hand fluttered just slightly, though her smile never faltered. She leaned forward, her voice slipping into that familiar tone, the kind she used when stirring gossip over morning coffee. "People are still curious about, well, your family," she said, each word carefully measured. "How you balance everything after the changes." The audience chuckled softly, recognizing the euphemism. Divorce. Custody battles, headlines. Kelly didn't have to name them. The weight of years of tabloid ink hung unspoken in the air. Angelina's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly, but she did not avert her eyes. The silence that followed was not nervous, it was deliberate. She allowed it to stretch, to make the audience feel the discomfort, to force Kelly to sit in it. When she finally spoke, her voice was even, unwavering. Balance is not the issue. The issue is whether we, as a culture, insist on dissecting a woman's private life while ignoring the lives of those who don't have the luxury of privacy at all. The words dropped heavy, like a gavel striking wood. Murmurs rippled through the studio. Kelly blinked, momentarily off balance. She tried again, her tone a shade sharper. But surely people want to understand you better. They want to know how you cope, how your children feel. Angelina cut in, her interruption quiet, but devastating. What harms children most is being treated like spectacle. Do you think they benefit when strangers debate them over coffee tables and magazine covers? Or do you think it robs them of their humanity? The air froze. The audience, once quick to laugh at Kelly's quips, now sat in silence, eyes shifting between host and guest, as though watching a trial unfold. Kelly's smile thinned. I'm only asking what the public wants to know. Angelina's gaze hardened. No, you're asking what keeps the public distracted. There's a difference. Applause burst suddenly, sharp and decisive. People in the audience leaned forward, clapping with the urgency of agreement, as if they had been waiting for someone to say it aloud. The sound forced Kelly into another brittle laugh, a mask she wore like armor. Still, she pressed, unwilling, to surrender her courtroom. But isn't it fair after living so much of your life in the spotlight that people expect transparency? Don't you owe them some answers?